the 3rd of January 1945. Ramenskoye Flight Test Center. The hangar hums with winter light as lamps warm to full. Steel tapes snap and rewind. Frost lifts from alloy in soft white curls. Alexander Sokolov stands under the belly of the foreign giant and follows a harness as if it were a sentence he must not misread. The cable runs from a junction box through a grommeted rib and up toward the brain of the remote turret. He notes the color logic, the bundling intervals, the way each tie sits at a repeatable distance like a metronome set to duty. He marks the wing route in grease pencil. Fuel is not wait tonight. Fuel is minutes. Minutes to reach a coast. Minutes to turn a continent into geometry. Minutes you can spend or lose, but never borrow. He keeps a running ledger in his head. At cruise flow, the left wing carries this many minutes of life. The right wing carries the same. The tank behind the spar is the buffer between certainty and the sea. A machine can be admired at rest, but it only admits its truth in motion measured against a clock. A test cell run bursts alive outside the first smooth surge of turbines, riding the exhaust, then the shriek that comes when heat and pressure lean into each other. The sound rakes through the hangar skin and sets a faint tremor in the ladder beneath his boots. He holds still and lets it pass through his bones. Smooth becomes ragged for a breath, a cough of detonation, or a misread manifold line, and the shriek claws higher before dropping back into a controlled roar. He does not look up. He waits for his pulse to fall to an even count. Assumptions wobble in that cough. Margins are not patriotic. Margins are mathematics. He returns to touch. Fingertips ride a line of flush rivets, each head cold and shallow under the glove. The lap joint sits true. The skin step is barely there. The seam tells him that whoever laid this stringer obeyed a jig that did not forgive pride. The hangar smells of sealant cooked into the pressure, frames a sweet chemical edge that sticks to the back of the throat and promises clarity at altitude if every hole is round and every fastener is what the drawing says it is. A micrometer in the inspection cell ticks and ticks again, the ratchet, whispering the limit between feel and force. He finds comfort in the tick because it does not lie. The words land without voice, then settle in his chest like a tool placed on a bench. He has said them all day in different shapes, but the sentence is only complete when he lets it be simple. Not improve, not interpret, not translate the unknown into the familiar. Copy first. He traces the turret conduit to the analog sighthead and watches the logic map. Unfold, leads, returns, power signal, ground everything with a purpose that can be proved by continuity and by fire. He pictures the sightline across black air, the remote hands of a gunner working a target he does not touch, and the promise hidden in that distance. If the brain is reliable, the man lives longer. If the brain lies, the man is a number on a form. Paper cracks under his boot as he shifts. A maintenance card has slid loose from a clipboard tucked behind the bay ladder. Grease has smudged the corner, but one line stands out in block letters that do not waste ink. Engine change on schedule. Bird back up tomorrow. He reads it twice. He imagines the schedule, the crate, the hoist, the line of men who do not argue with time, because time has already won the argument. Replace instead of repair. Swap instead of troubleshoot. A doctrine you can lift with a crane. A gust pushes through the hangar doors and the frost smell fades to hot oil. He listens for the micrometer again, finds the tick, and breathes with it until his pulse matches the calm. He looks at the wing route marks and the fuel minutes ledger his mind keeps without ink. He looks at the turret brain and the wire looms that refuse his instinct to invent. He looks at the line about tomorrow and feels what it implies about reach and return, about the kind of power that is not loud but arrives on time. They mocked the airplane the way a machinist mocks a parade uniform. Too many comforts, too many clever boxes, too much wire for men who ought to carry wrenches instead of cushions. American excess, Vorobyov said. And the word excess left a clean scrape in the air, as if thrift alone could lift a bomber to the edge of space. Sokolov did not answer. He set the inspection slate against a pressure frame and watched a gauge needle settle. The frame had accepted its rivets to a tolerance that felt like the quiet of a held breath. Add one shim to fix an imperial fastener in a metric world, and the silence changed. Add 10, and it changed again. He felt the change like a pulse under his glove. Outside, the test cell opened its throat. The turbo howled, climbed, then steadied. The sound came through the floor with the honest weight of force doing work. He wrote a number from the gauge and another from the micrometer. He did not write the number in his chest, but he felt it rise when the frame loaded against the skin and the needle moved one hair past the safe mark. Thousandths pile up the way minutes do. One makes no argument. Many decide your day. They rolled a crate under the bay that still smelled of ocean salt. A stenciled engine code stared back with an American indifference that was almost insulting. A foreman called for the hoist. Hooks kissed the sling eyes. The lift took the mass, and the old power plant began to free itself from the mount. No drama, no speech. Pins out lines, capped mount bolts, chalked hands, moving in pairs as if reading a script. A sheet tacked to a clipboard on the crate listed labor hours as a simple tally. Not a boast. Not theory. The hours to remove the hours to install the hours, to test each set in blocks, as if time were a piece you could hold and exchange. Vorobyov snorted at the log. Too many men for one engine. He preferred a story where two masters with two toolkits solved the same problem for half the cost. Sokolov looked at the line that mattered back up tomorrow. If a dozen hands can return a machine to the sky by morning, then the cost is not the men, the cost is the day you would otherwise spend on diagnosis that yields nothing you can bomb with. An elegant repair is a poem. A swap is a schedule. Sokolov let the balance sit there in his head and refused to polish it into anything easier. He followed a loom forward to the central fire control brain. The casting was thick. The junctions were labeled in a language that wanted to be purely functional. He traced the leads to the turrets and felt the promise of the system in his palm. A single mind to drive multiple guns with the speed of geometry instead of the fatigue of flesh. Crew strength conserved not by valor but by subtraction of load. He ran through a mission as if he were a ledger. Less time with hands on heavy controls, less time fighting drift, less time fighting the sight picture, more minutes held at altitude with clarity and oxygen to spare. That arithmetic buys sortie hours without adding a single airframe. It does not care who is brave. It rewards who arrives. The turbo shrieked again, a tooth on iron, and then settled. Mirova called out manifold readings from the cell, crisp at first, then a touch too fast when the surge came. Sokolov's pen paused. The pressure frame before him demanded a line of fasteners that did not exist in Soviet bins. The diameter was wrong by so little that pride asked to ignore it. He drew a tiny circle beside the whole callout, a private mark that meant measure again before you lie to yourself. The micrometer ticked in the next room, the little ratchet saying, "Stop now, stop now, stop now." He felt his heart pick up in the way it sometimes did when a solution asked to be handsome. Handsome solutions have killed more time than enemies. He lifted a panel that the shop had reskinned during the day and set it into place. It kissed the frame along three edges and then argued at the fourth. Shims might placate the argument, but shims in a pressurized body are not a kindness. Every added piece is another place where heat and vibration can work their old trade. He ran his fingers along the lap and felt a ridge that had not been present in the original. Small, honest, dangerous. There is a way to pretend that a ridge so slight is beneath notice. There is a way to pretend that exhaustion will not find it at altitude. The body remembers what you try to hide. Vorobyov held up a cutaway of the American control computer for the turrets and made a joke about gram weights and lawyers. Sokolov remembered the crew chief line again. Back up tomorrow. He pictured a cold ramp, a crane, a new engine fed into a mouth that would accept it without drama because the mounts and lines and connectors were designed for replacement, not heroics. He pictured his own country's engines and all the cleverness poured into coaxing a tired unit to give one more mission. Cleverness requires time. Replacement requires inventory. Inventory requires faith in numbers instead of faith in individual skill. He pulled a note from a pocket and added a small table he would not show anyone yet. Labor hours for swap against mean time between failures. Expected gain in daily sortie rate when the swap is executed on a rhythm. Reduction in crew fatigue where the central brain carries aim load. None of the rows were patriotic. All of them were decisive. If you can turn maintenance into logistics, you move the fight to a place where men with hoists and checklists become a multiplying force. If you insist that mastery must live in touch and tuning, you tie your strength to the wrists of people who cannot be everywhere at once. During a pressure test, the hull sang a faint note where two frames met. The gauge climbed a finger width beyond where it should have rested. Sokolov felt his chest answer with a brief, treacherous quickening. He bled the line and watched the needle fall. The relief was physical, not moral. Tolerance stacks do not negotiate with slogans. You must either become the enemy's drawing, or you must accept a ceiling you cannot cross. He put the panel back on the stand and looked at the turret brain again. The face of it was not handsome. It was squat and ugly and sure of itself. That certainty buys minutes for a crew that would otherwise spend them sweating at separate stations. Minutes are the only currency that matter once you leave the runway. A plane that returns with crew less tired can be turned faster, fueled faster, sent again before the weather turns or the target moves. None of this flatters a craftsman's pride. All of it flatters the clock. The test cell throttled down. Heat smell drifted in, mixed with the sweet edge of dope around window lines. The hangar seemed to exhale. Vorobyov repeated the word excess softer now, as if the metal itself had heard him and refused to be insulted. Sokolov closed his notebook without resolving the argument aloud. Perfection would fix the ridge and please the hand that felt it. Perfection would also keep the airplane on the floor one more day. He had to choose whether beauty lived in a joint that could be admired or in a departure time that could be met. He looked at the crate, at the log, at the brain that spared wrists and eyes, at the panel that demanded a lie. The betrayal crept in at the edges of the word perfection, not as an accusation but as a fact. Every elegant workaround he could name cost hours. Hours do not turn into reach. Hours turn into targets missed, crews flying, tired engines failing when a mission runs long. He could hear the micrometer ratchet in his head telling him where to stop, and he understood that the stop was not at the limit of touch, but at the limit of time. They took the damaged skin off, as if peeling a fruit, without breaking the flesh beneath. Chalk marks, rivet counts, frame numbers, all in order. The jig sat true. The new panel slid into place with a sigh that pleased the hand and the eye. Petrov checked the spacing along the lap, measured the step at each station, and lifted his chin a fraction when the micrometer confirmed what his fingertips already knew. The first line of rivets went in on the beat of breath. Heads lay flush, the seam red as a single intention. Sokolov watched the crew move the gun like a practiced exchange of tools at a surgeon's table. No voices raised, no wasted reach, no pride on display, because the work itself carried the pride. A clean job looks quiet. The panel held. The numbers said so. Delta across the seam during a low-pressure pulse barely whispered above the baseline. Petrov blinked twice the way he did when he let himself feel a small victory. Sokolov allowed it to live for a count of 3. Then a hand truck came around the wing route, with 5 crates stacked and braced, each stenciled with a code that had already begun to feel like a foreign rhyme. The lids came off. 5 more skins, same bay, same nominal curvature, same promise, and each showing some imperial whim that did not care what their metric tools preferred. On the second panel, the fastener holes traced the pattern perfectly until the last frame where the pitch drifted by the thickness of a thumbnail. On the third, the edge radius near the window line demanded a die they did not own. On the fourth, the dimple for a countersink differed by a measure that could be hidden under paint, but not under pressure. On the fifth, the alloy sheet held spring back like a memory, refusing to seat against a rib that had not been born with it. Success evaporated by arithmetic. 1 perfect fit, multiplied by 5 imperfect cousins, becomes a lesson about volume that no single craftsman can outthink. Petrov swallowed, rolled his shoulders, and reached for the harmonization drill to check the turret sight after the skin change. The bit kissed, the fixture wavered, then found its mark. His hand trembled on the second pass. He swallowed again, and forced the shake down his forearm into the bench. The drill slipped a hair against the jig face. He stopped before steel turned to smear and let the motor wind down to silence. Sokolov saw the tremor come back in the thumb, not the wrist. A small quake visible only to someone who had tuned themselves to other people's hands. The room did not notice. Time noticed. The cabin test rig came to life while they fought the panels. Pumps lifted the pressure a little at a time. The hull took on that faint taut hum that a singer holds in the mouth just before the note begins. The gauge steadied where it should, then edged down a breath as the second panel's new seam answered the load with a complaint too honest to ignore. Mirova called numbers to the recorder. Her voice was flat, more metronome than person. The visor of her mask fogged at the edges, then cleared, then fogged again, when the differential dipped into a range that turned breath into labor instead of ease. Sokolov felt the drop like a bruise pressed by a cold thumb. Metric Y. His private altar had been paid for with a handful of shims that saved a half-day once and would demand minutes from every flight thereafter. They chased the fifth panel across the jig table. The springback refused politeness. Clamps bit down. The skin tried to remember its old curve. Sokolov set a palm on it and felt the life inside the metal that stubborn wished to return. They heated the edge, a fraction coaxed, cooled, pressed again. The fit surrendered enough to pretend to behave like a child, quiet for the length of a photograph, and no longer. The seam stood within tolerance on paper. The seam wrote its descent into the future. Vorobyov made a low sound that might have been a laugh if it had been any warmer. He lifted one of the imperial fasteners, turned it in the light, and let it click against a metric thread that would never accept it. The sound was not loud. It needed no volume to speak its point. You can make a new screw. You cannot make a new day. Sokolov ignored the provocation and drew a line through the afternoon on his slate. 3 hours for the first 4, for the next 2, then a plateau of diminishing grace as the shop's cleverness met the factory's rhythm and found out which one belonged to the clock. They brought the engine cell up again. The turbo whistled into its long high note. A shiver ran down the ladder legs. Mirova called the surge earlier, this time voice, still even but 1 notch higher. Petrov steadied the drill and finished the harmonization pass, then set the tool down and pressed his fingertips together as if counting their stillness. Sokolov walked past his shoulder and looked at the sight head. The alignment mark lay where the book promised. The work was good. The work was also losing. Not by quality, by multiplication. They cycled the cabin pressure through a full profile. The needle fell out of the sweet band twice as the upstream seams flexed in sympathy with the 5 new skins. Condensation bloomed across the inside of a faceplate. Someone wiped a sleeve across the plastic and left a streak that caught the overhead lights in a greasy halo. Clarity at altitude is not a metaphor. It is a requirement with a number beside it, and the number does not yield to poems about skill. Sokolov ran the ledger in his head again. Minutes bled at altitude when delta P drops. Minutes bled on the ground when a panel refuses to be the twin. Its label suggests minutes bled in the hands when a man tries to stop his own shake-by, ordering himself to be a stone. The sum could not be argued with, only paid. He wanted to admire the seam on the first panel again. He wanted to let that clean join be the story they told themselves on the walk back to the dormitory. He forced his eyes to the 5th panel's edge instead and let it teach him the lesson he had tried to avoid. By evening, the bay hung with the smell of hot sealant and tired wool. The gauges on the test rig sat in their rectangles like unblinking eyes. The log from the engine cell recorded a stable run at power, a transient surge, a correction, and the routine notes that make certainty look ordinary. The shop notes on the panels recorded measurements that would satisfy any auditor who had never flown at height with ice forming on a mask. Petrov packed the drill, wrapped the cord too carefully, and lingered a second with his hand on the case. Sokolov said nothing. There are moments when words are a tax that buys nothing. They closed the crates for the night and drew the cover across the bay. The skin of the aircraft caught the last light from the hangar doors and threw it back in a muted sheen. It looked whole. It was whole in the way a man is whole after a wound has closed but still aches under weather. Sokolov stood with the slate against his thigh and counted the hours ahead if they kept to the path that pleased the hand. Then he counted the sorties lost if they did. The arithmetic met in the middle and refused compromise. The crew drifted off. The pumps sighed as the rig came down to ambient. A trace of fog lingered inside one visor before fading. He touched the first seam once, then the 5th. The difference was not scandal. The difference was time. Discipline had not failed. It had done exactly what it was asked to do, and the price of that obedience was paid into a calendar owned by someone else. The turbo came up hard and clean, then tore its own note with a cough that hit the ladder like a kick. The hanger picked up the shiver and sent it along the rails. Rivet trays rattled. A pencil rolled off a wing jig and clicked to the floor. Heat smell followed 2 beats behind the sound, sharp as bitten metal. Mirova called the manifold number before it settled. Voice steady pitch, a shade too bright. She repeated the figure, corrected it, then read a second that did not belong to the state the cell was in. The cough came again, shorter, uglier, a dog's bark in a cathedral. Petrov looked up from the sight head with his mouth half open and remembered not to ask. Sokolov felt the surge in his ribs before he understood it. That was how the body handled a system you thought you knew when it told you that you did not. He kept one glove on the lap seam they had fought into tolerance, and counted to 4. The seam was cool and true under the fabric. His hand could not feel the million small decisions folded into it, only the flat promise of the finished shape. He let go and listened. The turbo wound back to a smooth scream, then fell to a working roar. The cell doors boomed as if a giant had tried them with a fist. Mirova read a line that matched the stable state, then kept talking for a breath, as if momentum could make truth. He crossed to the inspection bench with the old shop slate already turned to a fresh corner. A single vertical line to hold minutes. A mark at 10, another at 20. The numbers meant nothing to anyone else and everything to him. Pulse over baseline by 12 at the cough. He did not write 12. He wrote a short slash to the right of the minute line and left it there like a cut you do not show. Vorobyov smoothed a hand over the central fire control casing and made a joke that would have been funnier yesterday about American engines needing grammar to run. No one laughed. The joke dissolved in the smell of hot oil and sealant in the memory of fog inside a visor when Delta P fell out of the sweet band in the faint tremor that had come back to Petrov's thumb. Time stood in the room as a third foreman. Mirova tried again. She called a rise that was not there, then corrected so fast that the two numbers tangled in the air. The cell operator bled the line. The note dipped. She chased it with speech and looked like she was holding a leash attached to thunder. A needle will tell you the truth, with a patience a voice cannot match. Sokolov watched the face of the gauge, not the mouth, that read it, and found his chest tightening against his jacket in a way he had not felt since a winter on another line, when parts did not fit and trains did not arrive. He set the slate flat, capped his pencil, uncapped it, then left it uncapped, and put both hands on the table. The order came up from somewhere that sat lower than pride. It did not ask to be beautiful. It asked to be in the air by morning. No substitutions. Copy hole for hole. Imperial fasteners included. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The words found the corners of the bay and lodged there. Petrov turned his head first, then his shoulders. Mirova's script of numbers clipped short and went silent on the talkback. Vorobyov started to object and stopped with his mouth open because he understood that a thing had shifted in a way that did not leave room for a speech. The shame arrived after the words, not before, the way pain sometimes follows an injury once the body has decided it will live. It came as heat to the face and a weight in the stomach and the clear knowledge that a craftsman had just ordered a machine into being by refusing craft where it had always taken its pride. He wrote a number in the margin without thinking about what it measured. Heart rate over working calm by 17. He added a second smaller mark beside it for the weight he could not quantify, the piece of himself that had always believed good men could outwork a calendar. The shop did not move for a breath. The test cell kept them honest. The turbo came up and coughed once more, as if the machine wanted the moment to be branded. Mirova restarted, calmer now, cadence reduced to match the gauge. The cough did not return. The loudest thing in the hangar was the decision. He began to walk them through the logic they already knew, but had not yet wanted to live under. A metric substitute that passes in a bench test fails at altitude when heat and vibration compound. A shim that rescues a fit becomes a leak path when pressurization hunts for teeth. A bespoke fix that flatters one man's hands means nothing to the airplane that must be turned by men. You have not met on a ramp you do not control. Copy the hole where it sits. Copy the diameter that insults your standards by a hair. Copy the thread that offends your bins. Fly first. Argue later. Vorobyov tried again, softer. We can machine a perfect match in a day. He nodded, as if agreeing to the quality, while counting the day the way a banker counts money from another man's pocket. A day is a sortie you will not fly. A sortie is a grid you will not touch. A grid becomes a city you will not reach before weather, before rail repair, before the front decides you are late. The city does not care how handsome your seam is. The city cares whether you arrive. He sent Petrov to inventory with a list he would have mocked last week. Imports first. Conversions only where the drawing and the shelf shared a number without argument. Mirova received a new script for the cell, announce only what the needle holds for 3 full counts. Let the instrument teach the mouth. Vorobyov got the worst task. Go to the drafting desk and copy the boring parts with the same obedience he had always reserved for the elegant. No improvements, no rationalizations, no quiet betterments that would turn into delays disguised as pride. The slate took another mark. Baseline returned -2. Shame did not leave with the number. it settled into a place that would carry it without interfering with the work. There would be time to feel it later, when the machine had flown, and the shop was empty, and the jacket could be unbuttoned without noticing the hands that did it. They dragged the crates that held Imperial hardware into the light. The stencils looked like jokes in the wrong alphabet. Men cut the bands and lifted the lids and found order laid out in trays that fit their palms with foreign confidence. A fastener that fits is a friend. A fastener that lies to you is a story you tell yourself before something fails. He let that be enough, while his stomach argued. He walked back to the panel they had tamed into compliance and set his fingertips on the seam. It felt right. It felt earned. It also felt like a museum piece under a blanket, perfect in a room no one would ever fly through. He kept his hand there a second longer for the men who had made it, then took it away for the airplane that needed to be in the sky. The cell idled down to a steady, heavy breath. Heat rolled through the doors. Mirova read the last line with a voice that matched the gauge. Petrov returned with a box that clinked the way a drawer of coins does when the sum is real. Vorobyov sat at the desk and began to trace a hole pattern he would rather have argued with. The hangar found a new pitch, lower and less proud. He drew a final small figure on the slate. Minutes gained if the order held. Not many. Enough to move a schedule by a line on a board that would never care how any of them felt. Originality would return when the calendar allowed. Until then, the work was obedience to a shape they had not drawn. He put the slate down, capped the pencil, and let his pulse match the slowest machine in the room. The hangar settled into the kind of quiet that has weight. Heat from the cell drifted away in slow layers. The pumps on the pressure rig clicked once and slept. He walked alone beneath the belly until the turret sight head looked back at him with its squat, impassive face. Leather creaked when he closed his gloved hand around the casting. The metal held a night's residue of work and a memory of the men who would trust it in black air. It felt sure of itself in a way that did not ask for approval. He spoke to the room the way a foreman speaks to a ledger. Doctrine yields to schedule. The words made no accusations and invited no comfort. They sat on the concrete and took their place among tools. He began the tally in the plainest language he owned. A set of Imperial plug gauges, full series, not the thin compromise kits. Go, no go, and where limits boxed in oilcloth. 1 week to borrow 2 to procure at scale, if the channels behaved a month, if anyone tried to improve the list. A rack of thread chasers matched to diameters we did not teach to apprentices. A crate of countersinks with angles that offend our bins and save our days. New drivers, new collets, new stones for edges that heat faster than ours. Each line a cost, each cost smaller than a season. Supplier chains next. He wrote the names on the slate, with even spacing, as if spacing could hold them steady. Imported fasteners through a route that would not tolerate pride at checkpoints. Sealants with pressure history and a shelf life we would respect. Gaskets cut to drawings we did not author. Loom tape with the right bite and the right aging. Harness lugs that will not crack in a winter climb. The price of obedience is not measured in apology. It is measured in parts that fit the first time and again. Training packets for men who have learned to survive by improvisation. He saw their faces in the edge of the sight head's glass. They would hate the packets until the ramp taught them to love what departed on time. A week to write the first draft. 2 to fold pictures into words that would travel. A month to chase the old habits out of the hands that had saved us by being brilliant and alone. He set the pencil down and pressed the heel of his glove into the slate until a faint smear blurred the chalk and made the numbers look older than they were. Vorobyov came to stand beside him and did not pretend to be a friend. He looked at the sight head as if it were a rival who had earned the right to sit at the same table. State your reason, he said. Calendar Sokolov said. Range, altitude, and temperature expressed as time. A year of doctrine buys us nothing that a month of obedience will not deliver sooner. The city does not move for our pride. Vorobyov nodded once, not agreement, not dissent. The men will hear it as surrender. They will hear it as departure times. Teach them to count minutes as victories. Teach them to be angry at delays, not at drawings. The hangar gave back their voices in a low, patient echo. Somewhere, a drip found a bucket and kept its own private metronome. He let the rhythm place his breath, then continued the inventory that mattered. We will remake the jigs to ignore improvements that add hours. We will freeze drawings that tempt bright minds to argue. We will write a rule that any change must state its price in sorties lost before it is spoken aloud. We will appoint a clerk whose only job is to hate delay. We will measure shame in schedule slips, and not in elegance surrendered. He touched the glass again, and found his reflection half erased by fingerprints. That was as it should be. A weapon that keeps you alive does not shine until after the landing. Petrov came in quietly and stood with his hands inside his sleeves. The tremor that the drill had awakened was gone, but something else had taken its place. A stillness that looked like respect for a verdict he did not enjoy. "It will fly," Petrov said. "It will fly," Sokolov answered. "It will fly, because we have decided that flight is the first truth." Mirova set the manifold log on the bench without drama. The last run had held within the band. Her script had a new cadence now, each number allowed to stand before the next arrived. She waited, pencil poised. "Write this," Sokolov said, "all substitutions suspended. Imperial inventory preferred where drawing requires. Clearance to deviate is a time statement, not a craft statement. Copy this order to every cell that touches this airframe." She wrote without looking up. The paper took the words like a machine that knew its purpose. He returned to the slate and made a second column that would only be seen by the people who had learned to love columns for what they keep. Hours saved per engine by swap against repair. Hours saved per turret by central brain against separate labor. Minutes gained per mission when pressurization holds with no leaks to chase. Minutes gained per turn when crew fatigue is spent on the target instead of the ride. He did not bother to dress the numbers for pride. He needed them to be ugly and persuasive. The thought arrived that used to make him angry. Perfection is not a virtue if it starves the schedule. He let it sit, without argument. Perfection still had a place, but it would live inside tolerance and repeatability, not in the clean ache of a seam that only a few could appreciate. He said the rest as doctrine, because saying it as a feeling would have been a betrayal of the work. A machine that returns safely is worth more than a machine that is admired on sawhorses. A part that can be replaced by any trained hand is worth more than a part that flatters a master. A day on the ground is a target untouched. Time is a resource that does not replenish. We will spend pride before we spend time. He released the sight head, and the glove squeaked against the metal with a small, homely sound. The sound pleased him. It meant the world was still a place where friction could be trusted and measured. Vorobyov cleared his throat. "I will draft the packets," he said. "Plain language, large diagrams, no praise." "No praise," Sokolov said. "Only procedures." They stood a while without speaking. The airplane looked complete in the lamplight, every curve subdued, every line honest. It had the posture of something that wanted to go. He felt a stiffness leave his shoulders that had lived there since the first panel argued with the rib. He picked up the pencil again and added a final unit that no academy had taught him to write. The cost of the old belief measured in hours that would never return. He did not attach a number. He did not need to. The figure was visible in the empty space where a season would have been. He blew chalk from the slate and watched the dust settle on the bench like ash. The tally was unkind and merciful at once. It demanded less of the soul and more of the schedule. The waste, he understood, had never been in the hands or the hearts. The waste had been in the prayer that craft alone could defeat a clock. He put the slate away and turned off the lamp over the bench. The dark accepted the confession without comment. The machine waited for morning. Morning thinned the hangar lights until they were only halos around steel. Frost had given up its hold on the skin. Men spoke in low voices that did not need to carry. The crates with Imperial hardware sat open like drawers in a desk that had finally admitted its purpose. Sokolov walked the length of the bay and felt the air change near each pressure frame, the way a reader feels the weight of a page before the turn. The fear that had ridden with him, falling behind not by years but by weeks, stood in the open and did not pretend to be anything else. He did not try to beat it with craft. He counted it with schedule. They pulled the covers, rolled the machine into winter light, and let the oil come up to a temperature that would not lie. The test cell crew needed no prompting. They had learned the new cadence that matched the gauge, not the throat. Mirova called stable numbers, with rests between them. Petrov checked the sight head, then stepped back with his hands open, not in surrender, but in a promise not to interfere with a logic that now lived outside his wrists. Vorobyov held a packet of procedures without ornament. He had drawn each diagram, large enough to be seen at a distance by a man in a hurry. Sokolov made the last walk under the belly and put his palm against the panel that had taught him the most stubborn lesson. It was not the prettiest seam in the bay. It was the seam that would fly on time. He felt no betrayal in that sentence anymore. Pride that delays is a luxury. Speed that arrives is a duty. He looked at the wing routes and saw fuel not as volume but as minutes. He looked at the pressurization line and saw clarity not as virtue but as availability. Range, altitude, temperature, all of it written in days and hours, not in speeches and oaths. He had once imagined doctrine as a set of elegant choices made by steady hands. Now he knew it as a calendar with iron edges. Strategic bombing was not a museum of beautiful machines. It was a schedule that swallowed continents. Every advantage that mattered had a timestamp. A central brain that held aim across turrets saved minutes of human vision when breath ran short. Engine mounts that forgave no fuss traded diagnosis for departure. Fasteners that offended a bin gave back sorties that would have drowned in cleverness. These were not insults to craft. They were acknowledgments of the only clock that counted. He pictured range rings on a map, not as geometry, but as routes that either existed on a given morning or did not. If the machine left the ramp today, it could bend one of those rings into a path that touched a target before weather, before repair, before the enemy's day restored itself. If it stayed for a masterpiece of correction, the ring would fade and return as an accusation. He no longer argued with the math. He accepted that reach is calendar-priced and paid for with obedience to parts that fit without drama. When the engines took their weight and the wheels began to roll, the bay did not cheer. It only thinned as if a pressure had been released inside their chests that matched what the hull would now hold against the sky. He watched the lift as a ledger entry. He watched the climb as a contract honored. He let the fear remain not as a spur to ornament, but as a guard against delay. There would be time for improvements after the first 100 departures, after the procedure had built a surplus of days. Until then, the work was to name the power in the only terms the war respected. Time is the only irreplaceable alloy. Availability defeats elegance when the clock is strategic.